Uruguay is a country famous for soccer. As we celebrate Russia's World Cup this summer, we've checked the Hall of Fame, and there are only 8 countries that have ever won a final. Uruguay, a really small country with a little more than 3 million inhabitants, well, they're one of them. They've even won the cup twice, and in both cases, they beat their neighbours Brazil and Argentina. So in today's video, we're going to talk about how Uruguay has beaten their neighbours, but not in soccer, but rather in economics. Yes, alongside Chile, Uruguay is the wealthiest country in America when it comes to GDP per capita. But it's also one of the most stable when it comes to politics, and it has some of the best public services. But there's even more to this story. We can actually say that Uruguay is the model for the entire South American left wing. Have you ever heard about their former president, Jose Mugica? He's known as the world's poorest president, and he quickly became the ultimate left-wing rock star. He's the only world leader who refused to live in the presidential palace and kept driving an old Volkswagen instead of an expensive official car.
From a life philosophy perspective, I believe it's better to live with little luggage. Just the minimum necessary. No material complexity. If you have too much complexity, you end up spending too much time.
Nevertheless, while Mugica had this simple lifestyle, his country grew economically. It attracted foreign companies and it became a pioneer with social rights. With Mugica as president, Uruguay passed a bill for the legalization of same-sex marriage. But undoubtedly, his most famous policy was the legalization of recreational marijuana sales. Way before California or any other country, Uruguay was the first country to legalize the sale and consumption of weed. And the country's progress, it doesn't stop there. If you take a static picture of Uruguay, you will see a country that arguably is the best place to live in all of South America. If you take a static picture of Uruguay, you will see a country that arguably is the best place to live in all of South America. Unlike Brazil and Argentina, Uruguay's economy hasn't stopped growing since 2002. They have a thriving middle class and the highest wages in the region, along with Chile. But hold on a minute, because not everything is a field of roses here. In fact, as such a prosperous country, you might expect it to have plenty of immigrants, right? Well, the reality is actually really different, and this is not because they have strong immigration laws. People just don't pick Uruguay as a country of residence because, well, things are actually starting to go rather sour. They have around an 8% unemployment rate, and their economic growth speed is reducing, while other countries like Peru and Chile seem to offer opportunities for everyone. So today's question is, why has Uruguay's economy worked out so well until now, and what are the current problems they're facing? Well, today we're going to answer all of those questions, but before we do, let's take a look back at the history.
America's Switzerland.
Uruguay was born in 1830 after a war between Brazil and Argentina. The British worked to negotiate the peace agreements, and they badly wanted Uruguay to be an independent country. So why was this? Well, Montevideo's harbour was a jewel, and they didn't want it ending up in Brazilian or Argentinian hands. Back then, Uruguay, it was almost uninhabited. It was inhabited by a tribe called the Charoas, but they were soon exterminated. This is why, unlike many other South American countries, most of Uruguayans have a European ethnicity, mainly Spanish and Italian roots. In those times, if you were an ambitious boy looking for a career and an opportunity to make money, Uruguay was the place to go. It was better than America, and it was better than Australia. It was a modern democracy with rule of law and a thriving economy. Until the 60s of the 20th century, this country was among the wealthiest in the world. It was way richer than many European nations, in fact. So now you might be wondering, well, what exactly happened? Because despite being prosperous among South American nations, Uruguay is still way behind any European country, let alone America. So what happened to make them stop growing so dramatically? Well, the answer lies in, of all things, the European Union. Yep. You heard me right. Dear viewer, if you thought this idea of a trade war was Donald Trump's invention, well, you're very mistaken.
In the year 1958, the European single market was created, and one of the first things they did was to protect their agriculture from Uruguayan meat. And this meant that Uruguay lost their biggest customer. The United States didn't want to trade with them either. It was in the middle of the Cold War, and they were too busy dealing with bigger problems than this little country to pay attention.
So day by day, Uruguay became stagnant, and the government in Montevideo, the country's capital, they didn't have any other alternative than to look to their neighbors, Argentina. All of a sudden, Uruguay and Argentina became something like the Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino of South America. Well, if Argentina had a financial crisis, so did Uruguay. If Argentina had a military dictatorship, well, so did Uruguay. If Argentina had a democracy, well, yes, so did Uruguay. So, dear viewer, well, what happens in Argentina in the year 2002? Well, they had the biggest financial crisis in all of history, the now infamous Corralito. And in the very same year, Uruguay's GDP fell by 7.7%, which was a big-time catastrophe. And this was when Uruguay realized they had to find new trade partners. But how would they do that? Well, let's look into it.
0 kilometer of South America.
During the 1980s, Uruguay returned to democracy, and the government did something really interesting. They created the so-called Zonas Francas. These were special territories inside of the country where companies were free to not pay taxes. No VAT, no income tax, no corporate tax. The only request was that 75% of the jobs be given to locals. Maybe this reminds you of something, because it's pretty much the same idea as the special economic zones that exist in China that we like so much here at VisualPolitik.
Today, Uruguay has 11 tax-free zones. There are 3 different kinds. First, we have those oriented to logistics and international trade. After that, we have the zones that are designed for attracting multinational corporations so they can use them as the headquarters for the South American operation. Finally, we have the areas that are meant to have high-tech industry. And this is why Uruguay is a regional leader in things such as pharmaceutical research and software.
But this is not the end of the story here. These tax-free zones have a unique advantage, something that makes Uruguay a model for other countries. Yes, dear viewer, here we're talking about political stability. In the year 2005, Uruguay changed its government leadership, and they had, at last, a left-wing president. That would be Taber Vazquez from the Open Front Party. You see, in most South American countries, having such an ideological shift in the government means that most of the work made by the previous administrations simply goes into the trash. So you might think that under a brand new left-wing government, those tax-free zones would no longer exist, right? Well, the reality, it actually couldn't be more different. And this is the great thing about this country, the bipartisan consensus. This is why between 2005 and 2014, the accumulated investment in these tax-free zones rose to almost $6 billion. And all of this happened while first Vazquez and then Jose Mugica managed the country.
Porque en el mundo no solo se busca ganancia.
People are not looking only for profit. They also want safety. And this is what Uruguay has to offer. It's not a matter of this or the other government. This is a genuine Uruguayan attitude.
And now you might wonder, well, what does Uruguay get from these tax-free zones? Well, dear viewer, there is a double benefit to them, actually. On the one hand, they are able to appeal to industries that otherwise would have set up in other countries with bigger markets, and these foreign companies need providers. This is why, sooner than expected, many small enterprises are created around the country. And of course, they require highly skilled labor, and that means good salaries. This is why Uruguayans don't need to emigrate in order to find a good job. But hold on a moment here, because we said that Uruguay needs to change their trade partners, right? Maybe you remember how we said that they could no longer depend on Argentina or Brazil for their exports. So you might now be wondering, well, what do the tax-free zones have to do with all of this? Well, just think about it. Thanks to these innovative industries that set up in the country, Uruguay could stop relying on the commodity sector. Prior to this, their economy was based mainly on soy and on meat. Today, they create products that have more value added. So let me give you an example. All of the syrup needed in Pepsi drinks sold across all of South America is created in Uruguay. In fact, there's a popular type of Pepsi in Japan called Pepsi Azuki. This is made with a plant called sweet bean. And again, the syrup for this beverage is produced 200 kilometers away from Montevideo. In total, Pepsi represents 7% of everything the country exports. And this is not the only example. One of the biggest paper-making companies on the planet, a Finnish company called UPM, has one of their main factories in Uruguay. And they've already announced the construction of a brand new facility that might represent a whole 2.5% extra GDP for the country. And if that isn't enough, Uruguay is also a software leader.
8 Uruguayan software developers, among the best in all of Latin America.
In summary, 30% of Uruguay's exports are produced from these tax-free zones. And guess who's the main buyer here? Well, let me give you a clue. It starts with a C, an H, an I, and it ends in an A. Nowadays, Brazil and Argentina receive just 20% of this country's exports. Another good friend of Uruguay is the Netherlands. The Rotterdam harbour is the gateway to Europe, and many of the Uruguayan exports go that way. To make a comparison, Chile's economy, despite being the wealthiest in the region, is heavily reliant on their copper mining. Half of their exports are this commodity alone. Uruguay, instead, it's got a diversified economy. We've talked about software, paper, drinks, and of course, soy and meat. But if you thought everything is all sunshine and rainbows, then hold on a second, because things are not quite as perfect as you might think.
Party versus government.
As we said before, since the year 2005, Uruguay has had a left-wing government. More specifically, this country has been managed by the Open Front Party. And one thing is certainly true. They are worthy of that name because it is really an open party with plenty of different ideologies inside. This is why, despite what it looks like, arguments are a pretty common thing in the party. So on the one hand, despite the different presidents, Uruguay has had the same finance minister for the last 13 years. His name is Danilo Astori, and you could say that he's one of the architects of this Uruguayan stability. But on the other hand, the Open Front is really a battlefront between the radical wing and the moderate wing championed by Taber Vazquez. Jose Mugica, the left-wing rock star, he's somewhere in the middle. And this is why anytime Uruguay's government wants to sign a free trade deal with any other country, they must face their own party opposition. It happened during the first Vazquez administration when they tried to sign a deal with the United States. It happened when they tried to sign a deal with Chile. And it might now happen as they want to sign a deal with China.
In 2018,
we will mark 30 years of diplomatic relations with China. And this is why we have put this date as a deadline to sign a free trade deal.
In this case, Uruguayan companies would save more than $100 million in needless tariffs. But this radical wing of the Open Front seems to be allergic to the word free trade. And if this was not enough, some critics claim that Danilo Astori, the finance minister, spends too little.
But this is actually one of the biggest problems in Uruguay. After Venezuela and Argentina, Uruguay has the largest share of civil servants in the region. 1 out of 5 workers is employed by the government. And if you add to this the enormous presence of an illegal economy, you'll understand why just 1/3 of Uruguayan adults work for private companies. In most developed nations, this number is more than half.
Of course, compared with Argentina or Brazil, Uruguay is a paradise on earth. But the truth is, if they want to keep growing, they must solve these problems as soon as possible. So now the final question is, do you think Uruguay should sign those free trade deals? Do you think it is still worth investing in as a country? Well, please leave your answer in the comments section below, and as always, please visit our friends at reconsidermedia.com. That's the podcast that provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And also, don't forget to support us on Patreon, where you can get access to exclusive content. And if you like this video, please do give us a thumbs up. And as always, I'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.